Hello and welcome back to the Raisina Live Studios. I'm Mihir Sharma, a Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. And for the next 15 minutes, we're going to be talking about Asian trade after RCEP. RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is a trading bloc or a proposed trading bloc of which India was supposed to be a part. But last year, towards the end of last year, the Indian government decided not to sign the RCEP agreement. It's now in something of a limbo. And the question that we're going to be asking now is, what is the future of trade for India, for Southeast Asia, and for Asia in general in this after this decision? Why is RCEP necessary? Why is it not necessary? Are there any other alternatives? And are we seeing the rise of economic nationalism in trading more generally and impacting this sort of decision? With me today are from left Wongi Choe, who is head of the Center for ASEAN and Indian Studies at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, and Sumona Guha joins us again from the Albright Stonebridge group. If I may start with you, what do you think is the importance of RCEP, and why was it, in your opinion, such an important deal?
Well, I think if WTO multilateral trading system is working properly, I don't think we would have this sort of bilateral and multilateral regional free trade agreements. As we all aware, the WTO system is a kind of in disarray. So you have a proliferation of bilateral and regional level multilateral free trade agreements. And in Asia Pacific and or Indo-Pacific region, I think you don't have many this sort of a mega multilateral FTAs. You have CPTPP, and also you have RCEP. For CPTPP, the standard for trade liberalization is quite high. So not so many liberal regional countries are able to meet the requirements. So in that regard, I think RCEP is a regional trade agreements about which many regional countries might feel comfortable, and India is in that regard no exception. So in that regard, I think the India's decision not to join RCEP last November is a little bit of disappointing from my personal perspective.
Shimona, there are 2 points I think that we're going to have to follow up there. The first is the state of the WTO, and the second is on India's decision. But let's talk about the WTO first. Is there a sense in which we are being forced towards this kind of large trading agreement because of concerns about the WTO? And just to summarize, the concerns aren't necessarily just that the dispute resolution system is no longer working because we don't have enough judges, because the US has not allowed any to be nominated to the appellate body of the WTO, but also because many believe, at least some in India and some in the US and some in Europe, and in fact some in Japan, that the WTO system has allowed some countries, we won't name any, to get away with too much for too long. So is there a sense in which there is an issue with the WTO that has to be resolved?
Sure. I mean, I think the dynamics that you point out with the WTO are absolutely valid, and it runs across many different types of countries and at different stages in economic development with different relationships with the WTO. At the same time, you do see this rise of plurilateral engagements, I think, which reflects a sense that countries are aware that harmonization of standards, at least with their neighbors, can be beneficial to their economy. So I think there are many countries that are reevaluating their own postures on free trade and the nature of the trading relationships they want. And of course that reflects in the WTO, and I think had a major role in India's decision.
So I'm just going to follow up with one thing on the subject of when you said harmonization of standards. And it ties in with something that Wongi just said, which is that some would have argued that RCEP doesn't go far enough in that direction, which is another way of pointing out Wongi's point about it's easier. Whereas the TPP in its original form and even in its modified form without the US did have a lot more behind the border harmonization and therefore might have been more effective and efficient for trade. Is it the case that with the US pulling out of the TPP is no longer a reasonable standard for future trade agreements to meet?
Well, the nations that did complete the CPTPP had been part of these negotiations for these standards in the years leading up to the agreement. Despite the US pulling out, they decided to go ahead anyway. So I would say no, it doesn't mean that those standards are not achievable. I agree with the point that the standards in RCEP were generally seen as perhaps less of the gold standard on trading standards, which makes it I think for the countries who were disappointed by India's decision not to join, I think it raises a question of whether, if India does not want to commit to those standards, shall we say, in this time frame, when will it be ready for higher standards agreements? I think that was a criticism that was heard at that time.
I think it's an absolutely valid criticism. I think the question that many in India had, if I may ventriloquize them, and these are not my opinions, was twofold. The first is that we have already, in India, had free trade agreements with many of the members of RCEP, and with one big exception, the People's Republic of China. And so unfortunately, I think RCEP began to be seen as a China-led initiative, when Wongi would not say that is an accurate description.
Well, I would say, is RCEP a China-led initiative? I think from my individual perspective, the answer is yes and no. As we all know that the RCEP is initiated formally by ASEAN in 2012, right? As a kind of response to the TPP at that time, right? So in that regard, I think the RCEP, which is based on 10+6 mechanism, is one of the many ASEAN-led multilateral arrangements in trade area, right? But if you look at the members of RCEP, obviously China is the largest country, right? So in that regard, China could play a dominant role. The concern is there. But you also have countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia. All of these countries prefer to have a very kind of high standard trade liberalization. So I think in India, the RCEP is predominantly perceived as some of the Chinese kind of instrument of Chinese influence expansion, right? Yeah, to a certain degree, from political and strategic standpoint, I think you have some element there. But I think you need to be more flexible in kind of assessing the strategic nature of RCEP. So I don't necessarily agree with the RCEP is a China-led initiative.
But Sumona, this speaks to a broader point that I think that we should start talking about, which is, are there worries, strategic implications, questions of nationalism in an age in which nationalism is maybe more politically relevant in democracies? Are these beginning to implicate the trading arrangement more and more, and is it leading to suboptimal outcomes?
Well, I mean, coming back to the question of India's position on RCEP and the fears of Chinese dumping, because there was no FTA with China where they had FTAs with other countries. I mean, it's a legitimate concern, and it's a concern that other countries around the world are grappling with in their trade relationships, not only with China, but with other countries. And so I think that you did have many domestic lobbies in India against the RCEP, against joining RCEP. And so I think we'll see this continue. I mean, these are groups, there are winners and losers in trade, and so you see groups, industry groups, others speaking up vocally, saying this is what we can live with and this is what we can't. It's happening all over the world. It's happening in the
it's
U.S.
a broader problem. It's in
happening
Europe
in the
and,
U.K. But I think you're absolutely right. There could be consequences to economic growth, at least in the short term, when you have massive disruptions in your trade policy.
Well, I think that the question really that then we should be asking is, in a world with less trade or less pathways to prosperity that have been built in the past by international trade, how do we look at development? Are there countries that you think are exemplars of continuing to be able to be part of this trading system that is being built? Are there places that are developing into manufacturing hubs of the sort that we would have hoped India would become?
Well, before taking up that question, I'd like to point out that Indian decision to pull out of RCEP is quite understandable. I think from domestic political point of view, it is a prudent decision to pull out of the RCEP because you have a huge, staggering number of trade deficit from China, even without FTA, right? And also you have strong domestic political resistance from many constituencies like farmers, right? So in that regard, I think it makes perfect sense from domestic political point of view. But if you look at the issue from the perspective of India playing a leadership role in promoting multilateral trade order, I think it is a little bit of disappointing, right? And also, I think it is a major setback for the Prime Minister Modi's activist policy, right? I mean, you would strengthen your ties with the ASEAN countries, right? And RCEP is ASEAN initiative. So in that regard, I think there is some sort of kind of setback. But I think it is good news that yesterday your external minister, Mr. Jaisankar, said that still India is in the game, right? So India is not completely pulled out itself out RCEP. It's waiting for other countries to decision, right? I think that's very good. Yeah, a very positive sign.
Yes. Sumona, is there a sense in which we have a question now about leadership, both within countries and whichever country can take the lead in repairing the multilateral order, and also within countries, leadership required to take the broader and longer view of the kind of global posture that will help development in the long run?
Well, I think as countries evaluate their own positions, maybe reevaluate, look at what their vision is for the trading system, certainly there's an opportunity to reform trading agreements, maybe modernize or update to reflect current realities. But this will be a longer term conversation. I think what we've seen in the last couple of years, these hard questions that countries are asking of themselves, that populations are asking of their governments, these hard questions will continue. So I think this will be a medium term effort to reform or update our institutions.
I think that, that's a good note on which to close, because what we're talking about when we talk about this crisis of trade is also a crisis of internal politics, which is that all trading arrangements require, as Wongi said, some compensation for losers, and in some cases those losers are not being properly compensated thanks to maybe domestic political institutions that haven't worked properly. And in India in particular, I think that we have questions now about our own manufacturing base and our productivity, and we need to work harder on those in order to ensure that, I believe, when we eventually join RCEP or another multilateral trading bloc, we will be able to participate as a full member. But thank you both for being here, and I believe we are still in the game, and thank you all for listening.